Welcome back to JML Recording. Today is an amazing day because I have Derek from Vanguard Audio, the one and only, one of my favorite modern mic manufacturers. If you can't afford a $20,000 C24, guess what? You now can afford a V24 from Vanguard Audio. It is now out.
It's official.
It is official, and it is the most beautiful mic I've seen in a very, very long time. Why don't we just jump right in and show them? We're going to be comparing the C24 to the V24 today, listening to the subtle differences. We've tried to do this video 3 times, people. Every time we get together to shoot out my C24 with his V24, there has been some issue. The first time
my mic didn't work because it had been dressed and undressed a million times at AES.
Oh, he had just got back from AES and people were taking it apart.
It was during AES that I came over here. I came over one night after AES, and
so his mic didn't work the first time.
Mine didn't work the first time,
and we spent 2 hours trying to get it to work.
Yeah, and I couldn't figure out where it was, and it ended up being something stupid.
Oh,
as it usually is.
Second time it was my mic.
Your C24. It was this big fat connector.
This thing is spring-loaded once you get the mic on, and it had just one of the wires had popped. So I took it to my friend over at Electric Lady Studios here in Manhattan. Big shout out to Roger Deller. Thank you so much. Such a great tech, so fast, so friendly.
Good as new.
And it's good as new, so here we are, third time's a charm.
Third time. Fingers crossed. We haven't actually plugged them both in yet since I got here.
It's the proximity effect, especially on this mic. I'm just so blown away by it. It's just so clean no matter where you are. It sounds like there's a natural compression. It gets rid of the room.
That's part of the magic of the CK12 capsule. Yeah. Is the 3 chambering. There's 2 types of capsules, like an aperiodic and like a resonator. The way that they design this capsule is genius and also really hard to pull off. But when you do it right, it is magical. I will say that the differences probably won't be that subtle. Yeah, we didn't set out to like clone the exact sound.
Why don't you tell us the main differences in your designs between the C24 and V24?
I think modernity is the biggest one. Like what AKG did with the technology they had. I think they released, I think it was either 50 or 59 that they released the Mark 1 of the C24. You have the Mark 2, which I think was a 70s model. And we can compare and contrast.
Yes.
They're about the same size, actually, which is a happy accident. I think that one actually might be a bit smaller.
It's like 40 grand right here.
Yeah.
Whoa!
Yeah, I know, right? Good thing we've been drinking. It's 10 o'clock in the morning. So yeah, you can see they're about the same length. This probably is a little wider on the diameter side of things. So we modernized the power supply. And the power supply that they had needs to be constantly calibrated. Ours does not because it's regulated in circuit, right? We also, I think another big thing we did is the old C24s had crosstalk between the 2 capsules across the power path. So we actually brought that way, way, way down. And I think part of the reason that we were able to do that and they weren't is just space. Like, the components were bigger. It was not as easy to do what I can do today with this. We don't use that giant screw-on Tuchel connector that's on there. We actually have a 10-pin XLR.
It looks like something that you'd see in a movie. It's like the space-age alien connectivity. It's a 10-pin plug, but each one is at a different gauge, and it's at this crazy layout.
Yeah, there's two that we're using for the power, right? So we're using one for plate voltage, and we're using one for heater voltage, right?
And so those are thicker gauge cables than the rest.
Yeah, I think it's 18 gauge wire in the cable. This cable ate its Wheaties when it was a kid. I've always wanted to do a stereo tube condenser. Telefunken USA, they did a stereo condenser, a tube condenser microphone, but they couldn't get full multi-pattern with the power supply on both capsules because there weren't enough pins. The most pins on an XLR that were made was 7 pins. And then Neutrik came out with the 8+2s. And as soon as I saw that on their website, I said, I know exactly what I'm doing with this because I've always wanted to make a stereo tube condenser.
Genius!
But I wanted it to be fully multi-pattern. And you need, for a C24 style circuit, you need at least 9 pins. Here, I'll just take the pants off of it. As long as we're doing gear porn, we should really
dirty.
Into it. It still uses just a single dual triode tube here. This is a 6072 5-star, although we do also provide a modern 12AY7 that's cryogenically treated.
Which is brilliant. Anybody that has a tube mic, you should have multiple tubes that you've had tested. Also, big shout out to Pro Audio Tubes, Christian Bowie Whitmore, hooking up JML Studios with all of our tubes. And Derek went ahead and he's giving you different flavors in the crayon box there, which is very cool.
Yeah, and you could use like 12 AT7s, which I believe is what's in your C24 actually.
Let's talk about that really quick. A lot of times, like you'll see an EF86 and a U67, like we have here, C12s.
You can put different tubes in a U67 as long as the pinout is correct.
So what's the difference when you put like a 12 UA7 or a 12 AX7 in a guitar amp? What is it doing differently to the sound?
It depends on, I mean, obviously this is the subjective part of audio, right? Like, so first of all, the 12AX7 is much higher gain.
Because like a 12AX7 is like 100 points of gain.
It depends on what you're running the microphone at. For instance, if I ran this 6072, the standard for a 12 AY7 in a C24 is between like 65 to 80 volts is like where it runs healthily in a C24. But if you crank that up to 100 volts, you'd get more gain out of it if you crank the plate voltage up and you also then balanced the cathode resistor on it as well. But like there's a lot that goes into that, like the way you set up the tube in a circuit. But what's interesting is, like, let's say we took a 12 AT7 like yours and we put it in place of the 12 AY7 that the C24 is designed around. It's going to change the sound of the circuit, and technically that circuit may not be operating as efficiently or as optimally objectively.
Can you damage any of the components on the PCB?
Not necessarily, no. The two capacitors that Stephen Paul put in your C24 when he replaced the vintage the Siemens or Bosch capacitors, which are notorious for crapping out, and I believe they're metallized paper so that when they crap out in a spectacular fiery fashion.
Wow.
The RIFA caps, the RFA caps, are actually famous for like starting a bunch of fires back in the day.
Oh my gosh.
That's not what yours were in metal cans, hermetically sealed, so they were a little safer, but they still would crap out all the time, right? So he replaced them. I'm using 250 volt capacitors. I would have loved to fit 400 volt capacitors in here. There was just no way, because this is packed to the gills.
How long will those capacitors last compared to these old ones that lasted 20 years and were shot?
I mean, so these are metallized polypropylene. Yours are metallized polycarbonate. They have a real. It's different than electrolytics. Electrolytics have a shelf life. They have a rated lifespan. Usually, it's in the 1,000 to 20,000 hour range for long life electrolytics. That also depends on how close you're running into their rated voltages, how often you're running them.
How often they're heated and cooled.
Yeah.
So we have to talk about changing the oil on the car. When I have showed pictures of my C24 online, people say, oh, that's not a real C24. It's no longer a C24 because 2 of the capacitors have been changed and it's been reskinned. Andy Fuchs from Fuchs Guitar Amps talks about this a lot, and it's just the bane of his existence as an amp repair guy, because he's like, when you change the oil on a car or change the tires on a vintage car, does that mean it's not that make and model anymore? Is it not that car anymore? It's general maintenance does not mean that it doesn't have the same value anymore, or it doesn't have the same sound or value to a collector. That is absurd. You're not replacing the famous CK12 capsule with some like Chinese capsule. You're just changing the plastic mylar on the skin of the capsule. It doesn't degrade the value or the quality. That's so absurd. What do you think about that?
It's like the vintage argument is one that I'm very scared to wait.
I mean, I get it as a collector. You're collecting an old tweed Fender, whatever.
Those metallized polycarbonate capacitors, for instance, that Stephen Paul put in your C24, objectively are probably better performance than the original paper and oil ones, or metallized paper ones.
I rest my case.
Now,
from the source.
Objectively. Subjectively, this is the tricky part, right? Like, why do we like the way things sound? Like a dry guitar signal. You've heard a dry electric guitar. It sounds weak and tinny, and then we selectively destroy that signal and turn it into something that's pleasing to our ears. But, the subjective part is like, okay, without getting too deep into it, what's your favorite genre of music?
Rock and roll.
Rock and roll. Okay. Why is rock and roll better than jazz objectively? Objectively, you can't give me arguments.
No,
right?
Yeah, no.
Like tubes, vacuum tubes, for instance. in every objective way, pretty much, inferior to the transistor. The transistor uses way less power, way less space, doesn't require a dedicated power supply. They're really tiny, they last a lot longer, they're not consumable, they're not operating at like however many degrees.
That's why everybody in
inside,
the 70s loved them when they came out. They're like, this is the wave of the future.
And it was. I mean,
it took 30 years for us to say, wait a minute.
Computers used to be vacuum tube based. Can you imagine how hot and how much power they sucked up, you know, before we could fit like a couple billion
I had to put a mini split AC in this room because when this gear is on, this room turns into a sauna.
Right? So like objectively, a transistor from a performance perspective works better than a tube. But tubes sound better to our ears.
The shock mount. I gotta talk about this shock mount.
Yeah.
Okay, so can I just kind of bust you out real quick? He spent $8,000 on the mold. The attention to detail is what blows me away. There's no compromising. And since he's made it, a whole bunch of manufacturers have been copying it. And it's so great because when you think about the archaic design of the spider mount and all of its inherent flaws, why don't you explain?
So a little bit of history on this. When I was at Avant Electronics, Avantone, and I worked there for Kin had initially conceptualized the shock mount for the BV1. When we started Vanguard, the first thing we did was we needed to do a dress shock mount. So this is like a 70-year-old design. The first obvious thing is the cutaway in the front, the open face. A lot of companies have copied this because it's the smarter thing to do, right? Like if you're close micing a guitar amp, you want to get right up on it. I've had vocalists ruin vocal takes when they're close working a mic and bump that with their chin, you know?
Of course.
Second thing is, these two little elastic bands are the same exact thing that hold up our underwear. It's elastic. We know how long that lasts.
30 years.
What we did is there's 6 jet engine O-rings. The guy who supplies these to me also supplies O-rings to Boeing and JPL and guys like that.
How long do they last?
Like roughly forever. Using like a standard M22 threading, this will fit on a bunch of other brands. Avantone, like we mentioned, MXL, some AKG mics, some Neumann mics even. This will fit a ton of different microphones. Because M22 by 1 is pretty much a standard threading for a lot of these microphones nowadays. Having that mic being able to get right flat up to a guitar amp grill or whatever, super useful.
Well, let me ask you this. How many capsules did you test before you landed on BeesNeez?
I tested the Tim Campbell's. I didn't test the Heiserman ones because I couldn't get a hold of them. There's really only a couple people that make truly authentic CK12s. I chose Ben for a couple of reasons. I've known Ben for a little while. He's a brilliant machinist. He can match the capsule capacitance, because both sides have to be matched or you can get all sorts of wonkiness, within 1 picofarad per side. He can do that. A picofarad, that's a unit of capacitance.
You and me don't even know what a farad is.
It's a tiny amount of capacitance. He can make them again and again to the exact same spec, so I don't have to worry about matching capsules. I can take any two of the capsules and put them in, and there's like 0 variance. He's a brilliant machinist. And he can make them in bulk. And he can tune them. If I say, hey, I want the deep dish or the shallow dish, or I want you to take a little more high end off, or this or that, he can do that for me. You could use these 2 outputs. You could run 3 in theory. You could run a vocalist. They're both straight ahead. And you could run 3 different signal chains in parallel processing.
I wanted to talk to you about polar patterns, the response to these microphones. Manufacturers will claim this is a cardioid dynamic microphone. Here it is, MSRP. Buy it. But it's not really cardioid.
There's a million things that can change.
What is true cardioid, for instance?
Well, a true cardioid microphone in our in the frequencies we can hear, as far as I know, you can't make one that picks up every frequency the exact same way. If you look at like scientific microphone manufacturers, they will have their frequency response chart. That's a whole other discussion. But they will also have a polar pattern chart, which will say, okay, at 10 kilohertz, this almost looks like a shotgun mic. It only picks up like right in the middle, right? But at 100 hertz, it's almost like a wide cardioid because of the physical nature of the way sound hits the capsule.
So why are SDCs, small diaphragm condensers, more true cardioid than an LDC?
It's the size of the capsule changes how accurate it will be in terms of how different frequencies will react, or how it will react to different frequencies at different positions around the microphone. SDCs tend to have truer polar patterns. They're still not perfect, but it's more of a true cardioid, you know, across all the frequencies than a large diaphragm condenser. And there's so many reasons for it, man. Like the head grill, you know, that we put on this has an effect. The way that we do cardioid for an SDC is different than the way that we do cardioid with a dual diaphragm condenser, like large diaphragm condenser.
A lot of people don't know this. A lot of people don't know this, but the original U67s had a yellow foam ring below the capsule, which dramatically affected the response. And they would start to fail and break down over time, and then, you know, the dust particles would come off and then stick to the mylar of the capsule and wreck it. And so there was something called the paper test. You would take it off and wipe it on a white piece of paper, and if there was residue on it, it was no good and had to be replaced.
I did not know that.
And now the new reissue U67s don't even have the foam. And I am a staunch believer that that played such a part in the dampening of unwanted reflection off the bottom of the capsule. It made a huge difference in the U67. People don't even talk about that.
It's the plate that it's mounted on, right? It's a flat surface.
Yeah, exactly.
So you will get early reflections, I guess, is one way to think about it, from that bottom of the plate.
Totally.
It's the same reason that they steepled the 67 and 87, whereas before with a 47 it was just a cylinder, right, which creates a resonant cavity, and this prevents.
That's why glass in a studio is slanted.
Is not in parallel, exactly. I mean, the best head basket for, you know, if we want a true capsule response is no head basket.
Exactly.
But I mean, condensers, one, are fragile, two, they're super high impedance, so you would start picking up a radio, you know, whatever radio station was within 100 miles of you.
Oh, so these are like Faraday cages.
Yeah, that's part of the ground shield.
I never knew that.
Yeah, if your head grill is not grounded, you will know.
Oh, wow.
Or even if, like, the body, I won't say the company, but there was a very high-end company that was not properly grounding the badge of their microphone to the body.
Wow.
And
so it was floating on the glue or something?
It was floating, and it wasn't electrically connected to the rest of the shield, so it basically became an antenna. It was sitting right over the JFET. And so we actually test the continuity of our badges to our bodies to make sure that that's not an issue for us, because the badge here is so close to the high impedance section of the circuit.
You're a genius.
Well, I mean, that's a trial and error thing, because I found out on our first run of V1s, our small diaphragm condensers, that they weren't properly grounding. We had to take off every badge, clean out the holes from the paint, and then put them back in and make sure they were electrically grounding, because it's sitting. The feet of the badge are sitting millimeters from the JFET, the impedance conversion from the capsule. So the impedance there is measured in gigaohms, right? So it's so high impedance that you have to protect that from external EMI.
Wow.
And you basically had a little antenna sitting over the top of it.
Wow.
And so
crazy.
I learned that the hard way, because I wasn't stringent enough with our manufacturer to make sure that they were masking the badge holes or cleaning them out before the badge was mounted. And we had to take every badge off and clean out those holes and then put the badge back on.
What are you most proud of with this V24? What came out so well that you were just enamored?
I think the biggest thing is the rotation mechanism.
That's cool. It's stepped. That's cool.
Yeah, it's stepped. It'll go out to 120 degrees, and it's stepped every 15 degrees. This is a rock-solid rotation mechanism.
It terrifies me to rotate the capsules on my C24 because it's literally just a braided wire going
Believe
to
it or
the
not,
top.
that might be the best one that's ever existed outside of this one.
Wow.
The SM69s from Neumann, awful rotation mechanism. This is the same architecture that the V44S uses, and we have one on tour with Olivia Rodrigo right now. We have one on tour with Kelsey Ballerini. There were two of them over the drums at the Grammys. They've been on SNL, so they're bulletproof enough to be used live.
Cool.
Which I don't think you can say about any other adjustable stereo mic on the market. The other thing I did is on the back of the mic, there's two switches, right? So one is flat, which is more like the original C12 response, and one rolls off like the original 251. So you can adjust the top end of your microphone.
Awesome. That's something I wish the C24 had.
Do you feel like the C24 is too bright? Because I don't think
bright?
Yours is.
No.
Yeah.
No.
But yours, the C24, I think sounds more like a 251 on the top than a C12. People, we've talked about this, but the C24 is not two C12s, but it's not two 251s either. Yeah. It's kind of this weird amalgam because it's self-biased. The tubes are
self-biased,
like a 251, whereas C12s had a fixed bias.
If you look at the specs on a C24, it actually specs out better than a C12. It has better response on the low end, better response on the high end.
I like the C24 a lot. I will say that C24s traditionally do not have good low-end response. That's another thing that we did. The T14 transformers they used, because they had to fit them in that body, T-tiny, right? Those T14-1 transformers. So they artificially roll off the low end in the circuit in order to not overload and saturate that transformer.
It's crazy how often C12s were used live back in the day. There's pictures of like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan on stage
weird?
with like C12s in their face, and they're just like singing at Montgomery.
Well, they were like cheap back, you know, they were like, people used to rescue old mics from like dumpsters when radio stations would get new mics, and they just toss their old ones, and now those mics are worth tens of thousands of dollars.
It's crazy about the gear that's been like disregarded. There's a story of a studio in LA that took a bunch of when transistor technology came out, they took a bunch of Fairchild 670s and dumped them into the harbor.
It's insane. How many hundreds of thousands of dollars do you think that they flushed down the toilet?
One of these crazy reverb shops is selling one now for $400,000 for a stereo 670. So and it's
that's
covered
too high.
in rust.
That's too high.
Yeah, it's just absurd. And let's be honest, when we talk about all these pieces of gear, how much is a capacitor? How much is a resistor? You know?
Really, for the Fairchilds, it's the tubes and the transformers. Like, they're probably custom winding a lot of that.
Yeah.
Tubes cost a lot of money. NOS tubes cost a ton of money.
Even when you talk about hand wiring a transformer, it's a machine that you're like, I mean, are you sitting there?
Hand winding. But here's the problem. It's about economies of scale, right? The reason that these are $9,000 when I make them, I only made 10. I have no economies of scale on them.
And
They're all
your
made by
R&D,
hand. Yeah.
you know.
The amount of R&D I did on them, I mean, if we count the R&D per mic, we're looking at hundreds of hours per microphone. But even just in labor, I probably got anywhere from 50 to 70 hours of hand labor per mic in these microphones.
Someone approached Pablo Picasso when he took 5 minutes to do a painting and sold it for $10 million and said, how dare you charge that money? And that took you 5 minutes. He said, it didn't take me 5 minutes, it took me 40 years.
Yeah. It's that story about the plumber, right, that comes in, turns one bolt or whatever, and then gives them a $250 bill. And it's like, okay, you want a split invoice. So it's $1 for the minute it took me to turn that, and it's $249 for the knowledge I built up to know which one to turn.
Exactly.
So similar thing with designing this mic. But the transformers in this are bigger than the transformers in that. We're using Cinemags that are T14 style, but they're much bigger. And that allows us to get more low end. It means we didn't have to roll off the low end in the mic the way that they do in the C24. You have a Mark II C24, which does have better low end than the Mark Is. The Mark Is had a smaller capacitor in there that I think they had a smaller grid resistor too, but I might be off base. But anyway, they did a couple things to roll off the low end in the circuit before it hit the transformer in order to make sure that the transformer wasn't saturated. We don't have to do that because we have modern technology. Remember what I talked about modernity on this? All the stuff in here, I have advantages that AKG didn't. You know, CNC machining didn't exist. 1% metal film resistors didn't exist.
Huge.
Electrolytic capacitors, I don't think existed when they came out with the C24, right? Electrolytics are a fairly recent invention. And that means I can get, you know, a significant amount of capacitance in a small package. They did 2 different runs of C24s. Less than 800 of them exist in the wild.
That's right. They call it the 800 Club. If you own one, you are a member.
And it's likely, well, how many of those, out of the 800, how many of those do you think are still in operation? 400? 300?
Yeah,
how many of them aren't either sitting forgotten somewhere or they got tossed?
Yeah.
So, or they just don't work.
Over time.
Yeah, or wrecked over time, yeah. You talked about like the reskinning of the capsule, the replacing of a couple components. I believe we opened up your power supply and there were actually electrolytics in there because I'm sure what was in there needed to be replaced.
The input caps are changed and the mylar is, but again, that's just maintenance, you know.
I mean, every single vintage U47, if you go and you find 10 different U47s from 10 different eras, 10 different production runs, 10 different studios.
If it has an original VF14, it's going bad. If it has original capacitors, those were designed to last 20 years.
Most of the components are probably going to be derated. The capsule might be dirty or covered in smoke, or it might have been cleaned, or it might have been reskinned. And not only that, but in different production runs, of some of their mics, they used different components because it wasn't as easy to get the components that they needed. So it's like, oh, we can't get 200 ohm resistors, so we're going to use these 250s or whatever, which changes the sound of the mic technically. So when people are like, oh yeah, this sounds exactly like a U47, I'm like, great, which one?
Yeah, exactly.
The
What's
other
your
thing
reference
is,
here?
remember how they didn't have CNC machining? They were machining stuff with templates and by hand on these capsules, where 1/10 of a millimeter makes a massive amount of difference.
So it's like a drum cymbal. Each one is different.
That's where the concept of matching came from. Is you could get two, for instance, like a KM84 from Neumann, that are identical, serial numbers that are right next to each other.
Sequential, yeah.
That have like a 9 or 10 decibel difference in output.
Wow.
Because the machining and the component tolerances and all that, all the tolerances were so much wider back then.
I just got some Electrodyne channel strips this week, and they have a 15 dB difference, and they're matched out of the same console.
Of course.
So
yeah. So this is the sort of stuff we're talking about. It's possible that there's a trimmer in there that needs to be calibrated or something, but that's part of why these brass capsules that they used in the original C12s, the original 251s, the original 414s and C12As, the original 414EBs, and I think that's when they switched to the Teflon ones. They stopped making them because it was so hard to make them. So the guys that make these, Tim Campbell, BeesNeez, Thiersch, Heiserman, there's a couple other guys too. I don't want to leave anybody out. But there were a few guys that make modern versions of that capsule. They're still really hard to make. And that's with modern machining and techniques. Back then, they were throwing away half their capsules. Because they weren't good enough. They didn't meet spec. That's why they changed the Teflon version of the capsules, because they were just easier to manufacture. And that's what's being used in the C12 VRs. That's what's being used in the new AKG 414s. I would argue that they don't have the magic that the brass ones do. They're not bad capsules.
I've had I've had 3 C12 VRs and a half dozen 414s of the new ones. Why are these mics so bad? Why don't they sound anything like the magic of yesteryear?
I think, this is my theory. I'm just going to get theoretical with you here. Back then, it was really hard. One, it was harder to measure things. It was hard, with digital oscilloscopes and the equipment we have today, it's pretty easy to make measurements.
Which makes it even more baffling why the older are better.
Oh, well, no, that's the thing. They had to develop with their ear. They knew they weren't going to get flat, quote unquote, flat microphones, which is not necessarily a good thing. They knew that there was going to be variance.
Brilliant.
And they had to listen. And so when we develop microphones, we make a point of not doing too much objective. We do self-noise measurements. We make sure that there's nothing funny going on with impedances or with, you don't want, there are objective things you need to hit. You don't want parts of your circuit to derate. You don't want a lot of distortion introduced in certain microphones. And other ones you do. Tube mics inherently have more distortion than FET mics, which is fine. It's total harmonic distortion. It's the reason we call it harmonic distortion, because it sounds better to us, particularly even order. But I'm getting off track. They developed with their ears. So when we develop microphones at Vanguard, a lot of our development is taking 2 or 3 versions of a prototype into a studio and putting it up against their best mics on a real world session and saying, okay, this is how this would perform in the real world. What do we not like about this version? What do we like about this version? Which version of our microphone did we like best?
So you think that's why the new AKGs and the new Neumann KM184s, well, other than it's missing a transformer, is so much inferior to the KM84?
Subjectively. I will say I like the way KM184 sound in certain instances, and there are things that they're super useful on. But I think KM84...
compared to a KM84...
Yeah. They have a lot higher output and a lot tighter tolerances, and they're much more durable than the original KM84.
New mics always have higher output, it seems.
Even
the new AEA44 has a higher output than an RCA44.
Well, the magnets are better. They have neodymium. They did not. Exactly. Have you ever seen the old ugly ass magnets? Those horseshoe magnets they put in those, and they look like they shaved them down by hand with a wood plane or something.
Yeah, like a file or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's interesting. I was talking to a piano tuner recently, and he said that the human ear is all interpretive, meaning we hear low frequencies higher than they are and high frequencies lower than they are because our brains are tuned to prioritize human speech.
Yes.
So therefore
the Fletcher-Munson curve is part of that, right?
So therefore, when they tune a piano, they're using their ears, not their eyes, to a strobe tuner. They're actually sharpening the low notes and flattening high notes. So it speaks to what you're talking about, using your ears over tech.
So when I say this, you can know that I'm speaking the truth. A good microphone can't make a bad song or bad performance better.
Of course.
And on the flip side of that, a mediocre microphone can capture a good song or good performance and have it still be good. The number of songs that I can think of, both old and new, that have, I would argue, like quote unquote mediocre engineering, but still, the one I always use as an example is Mazzy Star's Fade Into You. The high end on that, the tambourine and stuff, like it sounds like somebody's jamming an ice pick in your ears if you're listening on the wrong system.
And I know that song. It's that saturated with the craziest amount of reverb you've ever heard.
It's so vibey, right? And like the song is good, the performance is good. Another one is War, like, good God. That tambourine, if you think the tambourine in that Mazzy Star tune's loud, the tambourine is mixed. It's not in your face, it's in your skull.
But didn't the Avantone story, if I remember correctly, and you'll know, Taylor Swift, didn't she do her first album on the
first several albums
CV12
on a modified CV12?
And Billie Eilish used the AT440, that
4040,
like $200 mic to do her stuff. So it's all, you can make a great record on anything.
Let's think about it this way. There's a lot of emphasis on gear, but I think the developing of the ear and the serving the art is something that engineers need to remember. Like ultimately the job of this is to serve the art. It is not to, I love designing cool microphones, but I try and remember whenever I'm doing stuff, I'm making a tool. I'm making a paintbrush for Bob Ross. And Bob Ross needed different paintbrushes to do different things, but he needed them to be reliable, didn't want the handles falling off. He needed them to serve different functions. He's not painting the sky with the liner brush, and he's not signed his name with the 2-inch brush. When I think about it that way, it makes it much easier to make a better mic. Originality's harder. And we say that as I'm holding a mic called the V24 against the C24. We market it like that so people understand what it is. But this does not, I never went in going, I want this to sound exactly like a vintage C24. For all the reasons we talked about. Different C24s sound different, depending on the way they were maintained, which generation they're from, what components have been replaced, whether they've been
a better low end.
I wanted a better low end. I didn't want as much crosstalk. I didn't want as much noise.
Exactly.
I wanted more durable rotating mechanism. I wanted more consistency between the capsules. I wanted a better power supply. I didn't want to have to remachine my entire mic to fit that Tuchel connector, and that would mean remachining my shock mount as well. Instead of giving you the 50th shade of U47 green, I want to give you Vanguard orange.
Vanguard
purple.
On behalf of the audio community.
Originality's harder. There's a reason we haven't come out with a lot of mics. It's harder to be original than it is to be imitative, but I find it vastly more rewarding. And I'm sure, if somebody comes into your studio and they say, make me sound exactly like my favorite artist, that might be, you might get a kick out of that the first time. But when you're the guy that's the Billie Eilish clone or the John Mayer clone engineer, like, I'm going to make you sound like a worse version of this, that just doesn't sound appealing to me.
I made a song last night with a Suzuki Omnichord OM84 and a 1950s accordion.
That's cool.
And it's the coolest freaking song I've made all year. So I'm always looking for new sounds. And I ran it through a DSP 4000, the accordion.
I like the idea of originality. And there are companies that are making original stuff. Erland makes those triangle capsules. Super interesting. Audio-Technica is experimenting with like rectangular and capsules. That's super cool. New stuff is super cool. But ultimately the question is, does it sound good?
Yes.
It doesn't matter if it's a $100 mic, if it's a $10,000 mic. It doesn't matter if you made a mistake. I always ask engineers about what's a mistake that you accidentally made that actually sounded really, really good. I was just talking to Steve Jinowick, and he said, oh yeah, like we go do sessions all the time, and then we come out and we find out that, oops, the room mic was facing backwards. But it sounded good. It sounded great.
And then, like we always say, if it sounds good, it is good.
That's exactly
And that's what we're here to do today. Let's see how great this sounds. Let's start with a monaural recording. That's what I'm most interested in.
Because how about we do mono and we do one with the 251 setting and one with the C12 setting.
Let's do that, and then let's monaurally compare this CK12 capsule to that capsule. Obviously, a stereo recording is going to sound stereo, but it's the way the mic sounds. We're going to find that out today with our first monaural setting, so let's jump right in.
Yeah.
Here we have a vintage Guild 12-string. Capsules are set flat, top capsule only. We're in monaural recording. We just want to hear the sound of these two microphones against each other. We're going into Neve 1073s. We found that the output of these mics is nearly identical, which is great. Here we go. Just strumming in E, keeping it simple. Here we have a vintage Martin D18, classic recording guitar. Again, monaural recording, 2.5 feet back, just strumming an E, keeping it simple. Same exact test as before. We hit the switches in the back, so the V24 is now in V251 mode. All right, we're back to the vintage Guild. The V24 is in 251 mode. Very interesting, right? Okay, let's listen now just to the V24 in stereo recording, and then we'll listen to the AKG in stereo. This is at 60 and 30, pointed at the 12th fret in flat mode. Here we go. Okay, now let's switch over to 251 mode. Same thing. Okay, let's switch over to the D18. We'll leave it in 251 mode and then switch back to flat. And let's hear this beautiful V24 in flat mode. And now let's listen to a stereo recording on the vintage 1967 AKG Mark II. And the Guild. Angels, angels, whoa, 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 whoa. Ooh, the C24, the V24, the C24, V24, C24, V24, testing, testing, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. Okay, it was in C12 mode, now it is flat. Here we go. Angels, angels are calling you to me, oh, 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 check, 1, 2, 3. The V24, check, check, 1, 2, 3. The C24, check, 1, 2, 3. V24, C24, check, check, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3.
And this is why I make microphones and don't make records. Here we go. Said maybe I don't really want to know where your garden grows. I just want to fly. Said lately, did you ever feel the pain in the morning rain as it soaks you to the bone? Maybe I don't want to fly, want to live, don't want to die.
Here are some of the things I like to test microphones with. This thing will actually give you some low frequency response in an incredible way. It is a koosh ball paddle racket I stole from my 7-year-old. How about my favorite shaker of all time? And the old harmonica.
So one thing I do want to talk about a little bit is the low frequency response. On the C12, they use a little tiny transformer, and because of that, they actually artificially rolled off the low end in the circuit. And they did that to prevent the transformer from saturating. Low frequencies can saturate a transformer core quite quickly. So the low end shelves off pretty fast on the C24. Whereas on the V24, we used a bigger core on the Cinemag transformers. Thank you, Dave. And so we could maintain that low end. Now, when we get in close like this, the proximity effect means that that low end's getting boosted on the C24 and you hear it. But when we get further back, you can see how that proximity effect goes away. So I'm going to get in further away. Hopefully the lens is getting this. I'm going to get really far back, and then we're going to get closer in. gradually. And you can hear the difference on the C24 versus the V24. I'm going to do 2 back here and then 2 up front so that we can switch back and forth in the audio and people can hear the low frequency differences. Oh man, so we do some cool stuff with Vanguard. Our newsletter, we send it out once a week. We promise it's not super annoying. We feature what's going on with music that we like with our microphones, whether it be the Bygones, Allison Young and Josh Turner, or our mic that's on tour with Olivia Rodrigo, or like some tips about using stereo mics. I'm doing some video podcasts with Steve Jinowick. I just did one with Steve Jinowick. And I did one with Trevor Gordon Hall. I'm going to be doing one with a guy named Yoni Kessler, who's a live recording engineer for like orchestras and string ensembles and things like that. So, and you get tons of good nuggets. Steve Jinowick, if you guys don't know who Steve Jinowick is, go look him up. But his credits list could probably circle this room a couple times in like size 16 font. He was Al Schmidt's second for years and years. And now he was like a lead engineer at Capitol, staff at Capitol, Michael Jackson, and like 3 of the Beatles, and he has a crazy credits list. But all that stuff.
And he loves Vanguard microphones.
He does. He actually owns our stereo V24s.
Nice.
So, but yeah, if you like and subscribe, you will get the info as it comes from us in a sort of humorous, goofy way that is sort of just our personality. And yeah, you'll also get giveaway notices. You'll get special. We do coupon codes and deals for subscribers only. So, for instance, we did a buy a mic and get a free Vanguard hoodie a couple months ago. And we do that for subscribers only on a pretty regular basis. Usually every couple of months we have a subscribers only deal, whether it be a certain percentage off or getting something for free. So, yeah.
Oh, and I'll throw some JML Studios hoodies and jackets out too.
Oh, I like that.
That's a part of this.
I like that,
giveaway,
but only if it's like a bare midriff thing on me, because people,
you have to tie it in a knot right here.
Absolutely,
like
absolutely.
Kind of Jennifer Aniston-y. It's
very much.
Sexy.
I want people to see the belly button ring.
Yeah, that's very. That's all a part of the audio enginering community.
If they can see it through the happy trail, there's a lot of fuzz there.
The happy trail points to the knot. It's very cute.
Yeah, go down to the link, which is there, or down there, or probably all 3. And that's how you sign up. Anything else, Josh?
I'll be giving away my C24. Whoever wants it's yours.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. Actually, I do want that one.
Did I say C24? I meant hoodies and jackets. So make sure to subscribe, like, and all that stuff. Well, make sure to also say which mic you think would sound good on what source. Leave it below, any ideas or thoughts you may have. And we'll see you on the other side of the glass.